You're watching TelecomTV's exclusive video coverage of the SDN and OpenFlow World Congress event from Dusseldorf. And joining me now to discuss the issue of SDN adoption by the enterprise, I'm delighted to say I am joined by, on my immediate left, Mark Cohen, who is SVP Marketing at ClearPath Networks. And next to Mark is Martin Taylor, and Martin is CTO at Metaswitch. Thanks both of you for joining us again on TelecomTV. Mark, if I could start, SDN's ability to penetrate into the enterprise appears at this stage to be relatively limited. Why is that?
Software-defined networking actually got underway in the data center, where there was a compelling value proposition to manage soft switches. Then we moved along to enable operators, telecommunications operators and cable operators to exploit software-defined networking for some specific use cases, including transport, mobile wireless, as well as it's turning out, network functions virtualization. The situation in enterprise is quite a bit different. What we're seeing is an interest in software-defined networking, but a different definition. Much of the work is really focused on commoditizing hardware, in other words, white box switches, bare metal switches, and not so much on the ability to create a programmable, dynamic, and open network infrastructure plus control architecture for future networking. So I think part of it is a lack of a use case. I think the other major factor is the lack of, or the advent of the cloud and the whole movement toward services.
Martin, we say SDN maybe hasn't penetrated enterprise as much as we think it ought to, but you have a solution that's focused on the enterprise, but again, it also depends on what we mean by SDN.
Absolutely, yeah. So in many people's minds, SDN is very much associated with this concept of a separate controller and then kind of commodity switching elements. And while that's a model that makes sense in the context of network operators who are providing network services and that's their business, so that programmability and the efficiencies that come from that make a lot of sense. In the enterprise, I think SDN means something really quite different. So enterprises who are building private clouds to deploy large-scale applications, they need a fabric that connects the workloads in that cloud together. And they need connectivity and they need policy because they want a highly secure environment across those workloads. So yes, they're absolutely building software-defined networks, but not in terms of separate controllers and switching elements, but more as a distributed function where the software is mainly running in the servers, the host systems themselves, and there is commodity hardware, but it isn't necessarily programmable hardware. It may just be conventional, standard, off-the-shelf, top-of-rack switches and routers.
And why should we, here at this event, SDN World Congress event, why should we care what the adoption is like by the enterprise? Why should enterprises adopt SDN, or why should a large number of enterprises adopt SDN?
Well, I believe that enterprises are going to be affected and transformed by software-defined networking, whether or not there's a direct linkage to adoption. And I think the reason is that software-defined networking is changing everything, and especially when we look at the broader trend toward network functions virtualization. And what is going to happen is that the fact that we have a World Congress today that focuses on SDN and NFV, in a few years we're not going to have that, or it's going to be a very different type of event, because this is going to be the way we build networks. It's not going to be the future way we build networks, it'll be the present way we build networks.
Martin, are you seeing differences in IT departments, CIOs, in how they budget for their networks, and maybe there's an inability to go the SDN route at this stage?
I think one of the most compelling trends that we see in enterprise data centers is the increasing focus on containers as a means of supporting new style applications. So we kind of view containers as a second generation of virtualization. First generation, is virtual machines. If you've got a bunch of legacy applications that were running on physical servers, you're going to run those inside virtual machines. But people writing brand new applications in the enterprise typically adopting web-scale microservices architectures and deploying containers. And then they look for, okay, well, what is the networking solution that I need to connect all those containers together? And they need connectivity, they need policy. Connectivity obviously simply means being able to assign each workload its IP addresses and enable them to talk to one another. And policy means being able to nail down exactly which workload is allowed to talk to which other workload and which workloads are exposed, external to the organization in a very fine-grained and controlled way. And that connectivity and policy can be kind of rendered, if you like, in a software-defined way throughout the network. So we have an open source solution for doing this. It's called Project Calico. It's beginning to attract quite a big community around it, and it precisely addresses those needs, connectivity and policy, with a focus on containers. It works for virtual machines, but containers seems to be where it's getting the most traction.
Mark, do you see the similar kind of needs that are coming out of the enterprise?
I think that the trend toward containers, I think, is very significant, and it's certainly one that at ClearPath Networks we're leveraging as well to be able to reduce the cost of instantiating new services that can be scaled out to the broad range of either subscribers or small to medium businesses or even distributed enterprises. And containers are the future of, I guess like Martin said, I do agree, it's the next step in terms of the virtualization evolution. And one of the main reasons why there's a lot of attention is because of the overhead of virtual machines and the first generation. And because networking is always about cost ultimately, the fact that we can drive down costs rather significantly, in order to magnitude in some cases, to be able to deliver services that get scaled out, this is where containers, I think, are going to play a big role in how SDN and NFV are deployed.
Is cost saving a key factor at this stage for enterprises who may be looking to make the transition?
Yeah, I mean, they're looking for efficient solutions. And by the way, I think it's worth saying that generally enterprises wouldn't admit to looking for a software-defined networking solution. They don't think of it in those terms, right? What they're concerned about is they've got certain kinds of applications that they want to deploy at scale. They want to be able to deploy them quickly. They don't want the network to get in the way, but they want the network to provide, as I say, the control and the connectivity. So, in reality, what they're getting is a software-defined network, but they wouldn't necessarily call it that. And that may be one of the reasons why there is this perception that software-defined networking is not taking off in the enterprise.
I mean, you're both advocates of the open approach in different ways. There are alternatives. There are proprietary solutions. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest enterprise vendors out there has its own proprietary approach. Are we seeing a trade-off between proprietary and open, or are we seeing one favouring the other at this stage? Or what's the chance of real open SDN making a good go of it?
Well, the first thing is, one data point is the Open Networking Foundation, which was built upon the notion of open SDN versus SDN defined as programming a network in a proprietary environment. And the ONF has been one of the steadfast advocates for being able to create an open architecture that can provide abstraction at the lower layers to support a range of different hardware, and then abstraction at the higher layers to be able to allow for a number of different network services and applications to be able to configure and provide the intelligence and logically centralized control around the network, and to be able to package it up in a way, and again, by influencing and helping motivate the open source controller community that is now being used to sort of create these solutions.
So, Martin, why did Metaswitch adopt or decide on the open approach?
Well, we just think it's the only way to go for infrastructure, to be honest. There are lots of good open source building blocks out there for various aspects of enterprise infrastructure. Obviously the OS, right, for a start off. In the cloud space, you've got OpenStack, which is the open source solution of choice in the kind of traditional virtualization space. But then you've got a whole new generation of container-oriented orchestration solutions like Kubernetes, Mesosphere, CoreOS, And to try and push a proprietary solution, I think, in that environment just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, a lot of people say, well, how do you make money out of open source? And the answer is because people who are deploying mission-critical applications on an infrastructure, are many of them very comfortable with paying a subscription for which they get a high level of support, and they may also get some additional tools that help them with that, with their infrastructure solution. But the idea that what they're, the main core of the technology that they're working on is maintained by a community. They could get support elsewhere, then there's no vendor lock-in, and frankly it is less expensive than traditional proprietary solutions.
And I think the other factor that I failed to mention was that, and I think about the ONF as one of the industry turning points, is that in the past the vendors had a disproportionate influence on most new technology adoption. And SDN represented an opportunity for network operators to really assume control, or at least be able to step up and be heard in ways that was otherwise that was just unprecedented. And part of it is that they got together themselves, competitors and those from different industry segments. They started to band together to create these industry groups where their voice can be magnified by the synergy of the group.
And apart from promoting the benefits of the open approach, what more can we as an industry do to encourage greater adoption of SDN by the enterprise?
That's a tough one. Mark, do you want to go first on that?
Well, the one thing I can think is not to think of SDN as a definitive prescription for how this programmable open network is going to be implemented, but it will be adopted in different ways. I mean, one of them, going back to a point I suggested earlier, is it's going to be about services as well. The cloud is really changing things. I mean, IaaS and software as a service really just redefines how applications are going to be delivered within the enterprise. And if operators are able to offer higher value-added services at low cost, there's going to be less of a need for the enterprise to invest in infrastructure. And we've already seen that happening. And that's what the advent of the public cloud has been about, really the hybrid cloud, because data privacy, security protection, regulatory compliance, and so forth are driving a need for some level of infrastructure. But a lot of things are going to be outsourced, in a sense, through the adoption of cloud services.
So Martin, is the provision of telco services to the enterprise one of the ways we can do this?
Well, certainly the telco's ability to offer much more flexibility in terms of network services to enterprise customers through programmability of the network is, that's definitely going to bring benefit to the enterprise. But that's kind of an external facing aspect. I mean, I think, I want to kind of overcome this perception that enterprises aren't adopting SDN. The fact is, if you're an enterprise, you're building a private cloud, whether you know it or not, your network is software defined.
Yeah, the issue, though, is it's not just about the whether or not we have logically centralized control and even some level of programmability. The issue, at least when I look at it at the industry level, is really about openness. And openness is valued right now in the telecommunications side, in the cable operators and the service provider space, more so than in the enterprise, who's traditionally have relied even more so on vendors than the telecom companies are today. Because today they're breaking out of the mode of, quote, vendor lock-in, which is one of the main drivers behind SDN, especially in the enterprise. And at least the interactions that I've had with organizations such as the Open Networking Users Group, which is about 150 or 200 enterprises who are starting to think about how they're going to be affected by SDN, even though I would have to say that I think the adoption is a little bit behind. I think there's trials, pilot projects, a whole range of activities, but it's not sweeping changes that we're seeing through all enterprises today.
That's interesting. So like the telcos, they fear vendor lock-in and looking at ways to alleviate that and work around it.
I think the driver and at least some of the financial services companies, I mean, they want SDN as a response to vendor lock-in.
So Martin, should we stop talking about the technology, SDN, and what the technology merits and focus more on the services and benefits it will deliver?
We can talk about that, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so as I say, telcos are going to leverage SDN very effectively to make self-provisioning particularly available to enterprise customers. I think that they'll offer much more control over what the service looks like. There'll be a lot more flexibility in the way that services are defined. So I mean, and this is really a question for well, how imaginative can the network operator be in terms of identifying areas of differentiation where they can leverage programmability of their network infrastructure to offer enterprises stuff that is compelling and attractive and relevant to their needs.
Well, we'll return to this subject in about a year's time, hopefully, when we hope to see a lot of progress with the enterprise customers. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. That's all we have time for today, I'm afraid, but don't forget you can watch all of our coverage from the SDN and OpenFlow World Congress on our website. Thank you and goodbye.